everybody. Rachel Chaco here from Tech and Learning. Thank you for attending today's Tech and Learning Future-Proofing Your District Plan conference. A special thank you to our sponsors, Catch-On, Classcraft, BioWave, Global Teletherapy, GradeCam, and Stanford programs. And a thank you to all of our association partners. Today's virtual conference is focused on taking the lessons learned from current remote learning programs to create long-term plans that support effective teaching and learning both online and in person. I want to remind everyone to log into the Conference Hub using the link sent in your confirmation email. Once you're logged in, you can visit a sponsor booth, see your personalized agenda. You can network with over 1,000 of today's attendees via the registrant directory and chat features. You may access all of the conference resources on the download section, and you can win prizes. Throughout the Conference Hub, you will find several buttons to enter yourself into our passport to prizes. Please visit all of the pages using the navigation bar on the top of the page. Every time you find a button and fill in the form, you will earn one entry into the raffle. All entries are eligible for a series of prize drawings and only one prize per participant. You can enter once for every button you find. We will announce the winners via email at the end of the conference. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions for the presenters during the webinar, please submit them through the Zoom chat feature. Please know that we capture all questions and our presenters are happy to answer them as time permits. Today's slides and additional resource materials will be available and may be accessed within the Downloads tab of the Conference Hub. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. Be sure to use the conference hashtag #TLTechLive in your social posts. Please join me in thanking our terrific speakers who have kindly agreed to spend time with all of us today. I also want to thank each and every one of you for joining us and spending this time together. So now please join me in welcoming our presenter, Frances Gipson.
Thank you, Rachel. It's a true honor to be here with all of you here today. So I'm going to get ready to share our screen and we'll get started together. So welcome. This session is really looking at what I'd like to say is really the context of what does it mean to engage in modern learning and thinking about what are those systems for learners and leaders. And so as I join you today, I come to this work as a classroom teacher. I come to this work as a person who's led one of the largest coaching programs, the UCLA CenterX. I come to this work as a literacy specialist with a social justice mission that all of our youngsters need to be able to read and understand their world in very complex ways and be able to be part of the change in that system. I come to this work having led instruction for a district of 122 schools as their superintendent. I come to this work as a leader who has traversed from the classroom to the boardroom as the chief academic officer for the second largest school district in the nation. And so as I think about this work, one thing that you need to know is that I come to this work with what's called love-soaked leadership. I think in order to do this work right, we need to put our students at the center and really lead with love. And so as I share some of the ideas today, I'd like to start off with somebody who I think has really helped me think about what it means to lead this work through a systems perspective and with your heart fully engaged in these efforts. So I start with a quote from Margaret Wheatley. She says, and I think it's particularly important in this environment, that it is possible to prepare for the future without knowing what it will be. The primary way to prepare for the unknown is to attend to the quality of our relationships, to how well we know and trust one another. And I had the pleasure of connecting with Dr. Wheatley and some of her work through some of the women in leadership efforts. And one of the stories that really stood out to me in this effort was really around the story of the aspen trees. Anybody ever heard of this? It's a great connection to systems thinking. So I'll do a little story time with you here. Maria Shriver recently posted this in an article titled, "I've been thinking about the aspen grove." So a little excerpt for you. Walking among them, touching them, listening to their creak and sway, I could feel their connectedness. Above ground, aspen grow as individual trees, but below ground, they're enlivened by one of interconnected set of roots. They're in the most expansive growth of trees to share a common root system. This means they are one living organism and one living community at the same time. This is a powerful metaphor for how inextricably knit the life of the individual is with the life of community. So what happens to one tree happens to all aspens in the grove. So how do they live as one and many at the same time? How do they communicate with each other? How do they sustain each other? So much like the aspen trees as one living root system, we treat and look at these trees as a system. We can rush nutrients to any damaged area, the way immune cells rush to the site of an infection. And this huge root system allows those that are closest to the water to absorb and send the nourishment to the other connected trees. When we can accept that all humans share the same invisible root system, we too can rush nutrients to others who are suffering and need support. So as I think about this, we all see the interconnectedness with our work. I'd like to share with you through this presentation some ideas, some thoughts, some ways of thinking about where we are now based on lessons of the past and lessons that are yet to be known. And one of our colleagues who's really helping us shape the policy work around this is esteemed educator and equity advocate, Linda Darling-Hammond. And many of you might have seen her recent article. If not, we'll also put a link in the chat box for you from Forbes magazine. And she shared with us, as the president of the Learning Policy Institute, some ways to think about policy moves that can truly impact the work. And when I read this, I was thrilled for many reasons. One, she has a very strong voice of what should happen and speaks with such clarity. And two, some sharing that I'll engage with you around futuristic leadership and ways that we should be thinking about this new modern learning system. So here are a couple of key ideas as we think about her work. And again, the link will be available to you in the chat box. So she says, as the coronavirus pandemic continues, it's really important that we think about the quality of education that we're providing our students. And I think if I could underscore is really the sentence that says our education system has been deeply unequal and erratic in delivering on the promise of quality education for all of America's children. Now, that's not to say it's not happening in lots of places, but the question is it happening everywhere? And as we think about this current environment, so many of my colleagues are excited about the promise of the equity conversation being amplified. And the question is, as close as that equity conversation is, are we opening our eyes to it and taking action around it? So it puts this emerging truth really at the forefront of how do we define school, and do we define it in deeply different ways? Many of my colleagues are saying we must even mourn the traditional schoolhouse, take the lessons learned from it, but what might it look like moving forward? And so while lots of states are working on this and thinking about ways to close these equity gaps and rising to the challenge, how do we share these stories? How do we share these resources for this promise around changing educational equity in our nation? So I'd like you to think for a moment, what are some of the ways that you might personalize these types of features that she advocates for in her work? So that first one is really around closing the digital divide. And this is where we see huge equity gaps. As a matter of fact, in early April, she shares with us that nearly 2/3 of leaders in high poverty districts were finding that students were challenged to even connect to the internet. In fact, you've seen stories across the news about students taking exams in a fast food parking lot. So there's been a lot of energy towards changing that, and more energy needs to be placed there. As we think about the next one, it's really about how do we strengthen the distance learning? So much has changed so quickly, and our teachers, we truly need to applaud them because they've not only been hungry for the opportunities to collaborate, but they've enabled other educators to learn from their lessons and support one another. As we think about authentic learning and assessments, Dr. Hammond reminds us that there is so much that is learned in these new learning settings. And let me pause for a moment and say what I mean by learning settings. So often we've thought of school in the most traditional sense as the bricks and mortar of where students go to learn. But in fact, we're learning a lot about, and I'm not going to call it the home or the community, but the learning setting. We're learning a lot about where students are learning and lots of different ways in which they engage in that learning. And for those of you who have engaged in whether it's linked learning or project-based learning or deeper learning practices, you know that learning comes in lots of different forms and functions. So let's embrace that and think about, are there different ways that we can help students engage in mastery learning around different authentic ways that we can measure what's happening in their new learning settings. This next one about ensuring social emotional learning supports is so very important, and we'll have some sessions later today that we hope you'll take an opportunity to engage in. In fact, some of my colleagues and myself are saying, maybe it's the role of the larger system to focus on, here's the curriculum, and then let's help our educators think about how they can focus on the relationship of the classroom, what's happening socially and emotionally, and what are the intervening supports that might be needed. So really thinking about how do we help ourselves with our own self-awareness and that for our students in this environment, how do we still build relationships in new ways and help take us back to that story of the aspen trees with that interconnectedness amongst all of us. I love this one about redesigning. Every day, I think there's an innovative idea that's coming out around ways that we might think about students, whether it's schools in the Cleveland community thinking about mastery learning and reorganizing students by competencies and needs and helping to accelerate them, or things like you've seen with the Khan Academy, where they're actually stacking ways that they can show mastery and then backwards planning from that competency so that they can support students with interventions and with accelerations. The next one I'll talk a little bit more about shortly is really the role of community schools. And we know different systems and districts have different ways of defining this, but at its core, what's important right now, if ever there was a more important time to focus on this, is really how do we take away the fragmented social services that so many of our students need. And Dr. Hammond highlights a great community organizer in the Duarte School District who actually had a list of over 700 students and was able to reach out to them and find out what did they need, from access to the internet, to food, to helping their family get connected with unemployment services. So really thinking about schools as that hub and that center of the community. How do we expand learning time? We know that there's going to be incredible learning gaps that have happened in this environment. So what might it look like to come back and, let's say, loop with students or have smaller cohorts, or really change the notion of extended learning being just after school or perhaps in some cases before school, but how do we expand it over time and personalize that for students to accelerate and fill in those gaps? Kind of like when you cut the Swiss cheese, there's holes in different places for different students and different communities. So how do we make sure that we bring that sense of whole back? Again, the look at what's happening in your system about formative assessments. Again, assessments that really can inform what you're going to do next. And as a district or as a school site, how are you measuring those competencies so that you can work as teams to support student learning? Again, we're all going to be in this space of asking for more equitable funding, and then really going back to the core again about thinking about our earliest learners. And a lot of my colleagues share with me that we've done a lot of focus on a college promise, but have we done a strong enough focus on a primary promise, that primary promise to our earliest learners in our system? So as you think about these, I'd like you to think from maybe your top 3 list. If I were to ask you, where does your district need to focus, or where would you like to advocate? Maybe put in the chat box, which top 3 would you say are priorities for your district? Is it strengthening your distance learning? Is it about community schools, or perhaps looking at assessments and learning differently? So if you go ahead and add that, that will help us think about some connectivity between those that are participating today and resources that we can share along the way. Seeing lots of connections coming up there for you. And so if I were to take you to my classroom back in January at Claremont Graduate University, we started a new cohort for urban leaders because my desire was to prepare the next generation of leaders to have that love-soaked leadership mindset, but really come from that place of not only knowing what's in your heart, but having your mind ready. What do I mean by that? I mean that we know where the research is and we know where the practice is, and we can also be the leaders who design what the future of research should look like. Really also advocating for research practice partnerships in organizations. So often the research is looking in that rear view mirror, and what we really want to do is think about what does it look like right now in the moment. So there's lots of organizations that help us with these types of practices, and you see great examples, for example, in the Chicago public school system, where folks come with elbows at the table and really dig into the data and think about what does this look like in our system now so we can ideate, plan, and prepare for the future. So this existing state, desired state map, many of you might have seen this. My great colleagues at the Thinking Collaborative who work with adaptive schools and cognitive coaching taught this to me 20 years ago. And while it looks very simple, it also brings up many, many complexities. And so one might be to ask, what's your existing state in your district or in your classroom? And what might you like that desired state to look like? And so as we go through today's examples and exemplars, I'd like you to think about what are you learning in that aerospace that might help mediate from your existing state to your desired state? And again, recognizing that some of the things in your existing state are things that you will want to carry forward into your desired state. So in January, I published with some colleagues a trend report on futuristic leadership. And I was redesigning this course and some ways of thinking about this work based on the trends and the research, and also my practice in leading the second largest school district around academics. And one of the things that really came to mind in this effort was, how do we create these disruptive learning opportunities? And here's what I mean by disruptive. You might have heard the story of the person who throws the pebble on the pond and then wants it to ripple all the way through. That's the type of disturbance that I'm talking about. Knowing what pebble to pick up, how to elegantly and thoughtfully put that in the pond and create that sense of nestedness in your learning community so it can spread through very thoughtfully. You know, some folks always talk about, let's be bold, and bold is important. But also, if you throw a boulder on a pond, what happens sometimes? You get a mess. And everybody asks, why are we going around this boulder? So I want us to be thinking about what are the mindsets and the ways that we need to be intentional about our practices. What's the curiosity and the innovation and creativity that needs to take place? And how we can sustain the journey as those ripples go through that pond. We do this by making sure that we have really inclusive and collaborative spaces. So what's the voice in your system? And when we think about voice, it's from the voice of our students, our parents, our leaders. It's that community capacity around voice. And it's so fascinating to me as we talk to districts. I'll ask them, where's your student data? Where's your feedback loop on students? And unfortunately, I'm not hearing that in enough places. So as a person who always says she's on Team Kid and we put students in the center, know that that's always going to be a place of advocacy, thinking about who are our students, what are they saying, what are their experiences, and how might we collect more qualitative and quantitative data around what that means. So what are some resources that might help support you in this space? Well, some of them are tried and true, and they're really coming forward in this tested time. Great resources from Harvard Business Press around adaptive leadership, a great love of mine, the adaptive schoolwork, and also looking at the future of management that really looked at how do we democratize leadership? How do we democratize leadership, and what are those different skill sets that we need to be in a flourishing place? And what's interesting is that many of the case studies that he highlights right now are businesses that are still thriving in this environment. I also want to call attention to the Green Book there, polarity management. A wise superintendent, Superintendent Cortinez, many of them called him the America's superintendent. He'd been chancellor of New York, San Francisco, LA 3 times, just a leader among leaders. And so he asked me one day, he says, Gipson, actually he would call me Doc. He said, what is the job of a superintendent? And I looked at him, of course, I joked a little bit at first. I said, sir, I said, I hope you know that. And with a little levity, he goes, tell me quickly, what's the job of a superintendent? And I said, well, superintendent is a polarity manager. And he said to me, well, what do you mean by that? So I went back to this work of Barry Johnson. And so for a moment with me, everybody take what is probably going to be the first long breath of your day. Take a deep breath in with me. What did your body naturally want to do? Release that breath. Well, in a way, you've just experienced polarity management. You must breathe in and you must breathe out. You must balance those two. It's like standing on the stability ball, right? You oscillate back and forth, but you're not on a seesaw. So when you think about polarity management, it's about both and thinking. It's about breathing in and out. It's about stability and change. It's about now and the future. It's not either or thinking. Either or thinking is problem solving. It's something you can literally put on a list and check off. The challenge so frequently is we put things on a check-off list that are actually polarities to manage. So if you're thinking about communication or trust, the challenges of structure and freedom in organizations, stability and change, you're actually looking at polarity management and how do you leverage the both and thinking of your organization. I think we're in a place in our country right now and where we are with schooling that it's more about both and thinking than either or thinking. So it's at the intersection of this adaptive type of leadership, design and systems thinking that we're able to engage in empathy, that heart piece, and allow for our observation to lead to deeper connections and interconnections. That work allows us to innovate, to be curious. And my great colleague always says, you better get curious before you get furious. Investigate, unpack it, learn about it, help others learn. Take them through those change efforts together. And so I've grabbed some text from that trend report. And again, we're going to share these resources with you. But ways to think about how would you do this as a future education leader? And by future education leader, I'm thinking about how do you forecast into the future? You know, a great colleague said that school principals need to be thinking 25 years in the future, and superintendents need to be thinking 50 years in the future. And in fact, our classroom teachers are doing what? Preparing students for jobs that have yet to be created. So our orientation really needs to be in this present, but also with a future thought. And as we think about this, and especially in this environment around this curiosity and creativity and innovation, technology has really been a partner on this rigor and relevance path. And we know that this is so important as we think about college and career readiness and the types of resources that students are going to need. Technology can also help us have insight into how our students are learning, where they're learning in these different learning settings, and also help us think about enterprise dashboards and ways to get insight into what's happening with our whole child. What I mean by that is perhaps there's an attendance pattern and you're able to look at assessments and you're also able to look at outreach patterns and put all those data sets together to help bring some insights into what's happening with your students, but have the relationship also then to know what to do with those students based on those patterns. Another way that we can think about technology in the classroom comes from the great work that you've seen with the International Society for Technology and Education. You guys know this as ISTE. And I would encourage you to take a look at their standards and what they mean for students. In my work as Chief Academic Officer in LA Unified School District, we were the first district in the nation to adopt these standards. And what I found so powerful about that, it really is a framework for innovation. And it really is about a mindset that prepares learners to, quite frankly, thrive. So as you think about this use of technology, I also want to put a caution out there. Richard Collada, the CEO of ISTE, shared once, not just once, but many times, that technology is an accelerator. It can amplify great instruction. It can also amplify things that we don't want to see in instruction. So as we did our work in LA Unified, it was really about how do you lead with instruction? And so we found this to be a really powerful companion to that. to think about, again, how would we help our students prepare to learn and thrive and build the capacity around the adult learning in those efforts. As we do that work, we get into what's called deeper learning. And deeper learning is really looking, as colleagues, for example, the Hewlett Foundation has done a lot of resourcing in this capacity to think about what's that core academic content that we want our students to know, again, leading with instruction. How do we want them to think and critically solve problems? How do we want them to communicate effectively, work collaboratively? Most importantly, learn how to learn, which at this time is never been more important. And how to develop their academic mindsets, their dispositions around their scholarly adventures, and how they know themselves as learners. As we think about how students know themselves as learners, I'm going to connect back to what I started with in the beginning around this teen kid idea, around how do we help get the voice of our students and what do we know about our students. And so one of the premier authors in this area, and I will say a dear friend, is Dr. Russ Quaglia. And when I engaged in the work as superintendent, the very first conference that we ever did, I said, Russ, you've got to come out and talk to our leaders and our learners. Because what he does is he situates voice at the center. And as I said earlier, how are you situating an opportunity to hear from your students about their experiences? What are you learning about them before this pandemic? What are you learning right now in the midst of it? And what will you continue to learn afterwards? And he really challenges us to think about what's the reciprocity between the data that we see for our educators in the classroom and what are our students saying. And as you look at those numbers, the one that really stands out, of course, is the 94%. All of our students believe that they can be successful. But what do we know about what their aspirations are? What do we know about them both dreaming and doing? And so to help us in this environment, Dr. Quaglia put out an article from ISTE, which we'll also put into the chat box for you, with, again, this pattern of 10 different dispositions that can help us really think about ways that we can engage in more student voice. And as you think about, the thinking outside the box, he asks us to think inside this Zoom box, one thing that we're participating in right now. What are the ways that we can still connect with students? How do we personalize our workspace? How do we help our students, take one step closer to building relationships with their teachers in new ways that perhaps may be different from the classroom? Or if you're anybody who is a fan of Yoda out there, I love this concept of become a Yoda. There might be some things, just like that morning perhaps of the traditional schoolhouse, that we might need to unlearn in order to engage in new learning. So embrace your inner Yoda and use number 7, because it's okay to smile. And we might find in some of these adventures that those unmasked heroes are really our students. We see across the social media context so many ways that students and leaders are making a difference together in really positive ways, whether it's the notion of gratitude or the chalk art that you see across the streets, or those notes from teachers to graduates during this season. And most importantly, in all of this work, I think we all know this is true, don't forget about who you are and taking care of yourself, number 10 in this work. As I start every session with my urban leaders, we always start with really that space of grounding. Who are we? How do we bring ourselves to the work? And how might we end our day with a notion of gratitude and reflection, and really look at the science of that positive psychology behind that and how that can make a difference in our world. So some connections we've made so far. If we want to be leaders, classroom leaders, district leaders, state leaders, we need to model and advocate for these deeper types of practices. This holds promise for uniting us in this 21st century world where social emotional learning is important, things like the ISTE standards that help us really think about a thriving framework to prepare our students for college and career and their life plans. And at its foundation, all of this work is really about agency, that belief that we can make a difference in our work, and finding ways to have students engage in even more efforts around agency, acknowledging who they are in that whole child sense. What do they bring? and how might we help amplify those opportunities? How do we become a facilitator of their learning experience and help them with that dreaming and doing that Dr. Qualia challenges us to do? So as we think about voice and choice, I think there's perhaps no better way to do this than in the community school. The community school is a way, again, going back to Linda Darling-Hammond's connections, ways that we can use that both and thinking. What does the academic setting look like? And what are all those wraparound services that we know so dearly that our students and communities need? How do we meet, again, what's known as the technical and the adaptive needs in those local environments? And so as these hubs come together, they can really serve as places of wellness for our community. And our schools are the most trusted place. If you think about all the time our students and leaders and community members are connected, it's usually around that child. And our school can become that nested learning, like that pebble on the pond, and serve those needs of the whole child. So some resources that might help you in this space as we think about this. A great book on community schools. It's really about voices from the field and different case studies and the research, and really like that example that you saw earlier with the community coordinator in Duarte. What does this really look like? Great idea, putting it into practice, and then the lessons learned from it. And as we think about lessons learned, some of you might be wondering, like, well, why are you putting this picture of shuttered schools right next to it? Here's why. As we look at the research, so many of the schools that have been closed down or shuttered, as they say, really stem from issues around race and community, closures around economics. So how might we help these systems flourish before we shutter? It's an opportunity to reflect and look at what the history has told us around that. So it's a way of thinking and contrasting the concept of community to shutter. What caused it to shutter, and how might we better support our communities? In the corner, you also see a report that came out from USC, From Resistance to Renewal. What's powerful about that is actually an economic recovery story. So as we think about where we are right now and a nation of unemployment and diminished resources that will continue to perhaps diminish in the future, how do we shift what our communities will look like? And it's a great companion to what you see in the community schools effort. And lastly, on the screen there, I'd like to highlight The Blue Book by Tyrone Howard. Once upon a time, my colleague at UCLA Center X, and a great champion of equity and making lots of connections to what's happening with wraparound services and social emotional learning. And his assertions around what we can do now in a very culturally relevant, responsive way to help all of our students thrive. So from the book Community Schools develop a culture in which the overall well-being of children, it's supported so that teachers can also focus on the job of teaching. As our teachers focus on this work and we think about this role of community schools, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the importance of what we see in the research around trauma-informed schools. And this is going to be even more important as we think about what the remote to restart environment will look like for your district and your school. So out of a national survey of children's exposure to violence, they found that over 60% of children surveyed experienced some form of trauma, crime, or abuse in the prior year, and some with multiple traumas. I want to mark that this was prior to this pandemic. This was prior to this pandemic. So what might this look like in the students' current learning environment and as they return to school? We want to make sure that some of the professional development that you're engaging in as districts, and as you return for what your new environment will look like, that there's resourcing around this, not only with our mental health professionals, but what might a teacher need to know and be able to do to help support students with referrals, with resources, and also just that relational connection in the classroom. So as we think about this, even in the state of California, they have a first-time ever Surgeon General who's even going into our earliest learning centers to really think about how this impacts the brain and learning for our students. So again, special attention to this as you think about your futuristic school from that existing state and into that desired state. So I've shared a lot of information with you, from thinking about that love-stoked leadership all the way to thinking about what are some of the things that I would want to see in this environment, both from the content, that academic piece, the supports around it, and the ways in which we might lead those efforts. And so as we come to this space and you think about things you've been putting in the chat box, let's take some time to think about, well, what's next? So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and come back and think about what are some questions you might have as we look at the chat box together and the resources that we have shared. So lots of questions around folks marking questions and marking the importance of social emotional learning. And we will also have a session today around that and some free resources. I'll encourage you also to check out one of our sponsors, Sanford Programs, who has put together what's called a Harmony program around social emotional learning. They have an Inspire pathway that also has modules with professional development that's already been curated. And those of you for school leaders, you can even print out a resource list and a certificate of participation. And also access to all of their webinars, all made free by philanthropist T. Denny Sanford. Also, questions around distance learning and how to close that digital divide. What are some formative assessments to support the learning? And I will add some of those additional ones, and you'll see them in also the COVID article by Linda Darling-Hammond. What's really important in this space, and perhaps this might be a synergy conversation with myself and many of my colleagues. One of the challenges that we're seeing in districts is that they haven't in all places identified what will we count as competency. Now, this is really important because as you think about pulling data from lots of different sources, one of the challenges is people are gathering time around time spent on particular apps or time spent online. Well, that doesn't necessarily tell you what proficiency is or a way to mark a grade. It might also give you new patterns around supports that students might need. So much like the Khan Academy example that I've shared around mastery learning and practices that folks are engaging around those efforts, what we've suggested is, for example, if you're using Google Classroom and there's that topics category, how do you backwards plan for what you're going to count as mastery? And say, here are the strategies, here are the activities that we want students to be able to participate in. That's been one of the biggest struggles that I've seen most districts engage in, is trying to measure, like, what will they count as competency, and then using the formative assessments to help them support those areas. Again, lots of great diagnostics out there. And that article has lots of great links for you. And you might want to also add to the chat box some strategies that your district is using. Another resource that might answer some of these questions, and one of our colleagues today is presenting, Chief Academic Officer in Miami-Dade School District, Maria Escudero. On their district website, they have what's called a continuity of learning plan, where they've put together all their curriculum and resources in a very public way to help folks think about what curriculum we have available and ways that you can get connected to your teachers and their classrooms as well. What is the Harmony program? So Harmony was started with, it's out of National University, and philanthropist T. Denny Sanford put together a vision around helping students have, one, the most inspirational teachers, and also to support them around social emotional learning. And so they've designed lots of free resources. And you can actually sign up, get a free account. There's no cost at all to the participants. They do lots of partnerships with districts. In fact, they work with almost every major large district. And you can find their information at the sponsor booths as well. I see a good colleague here, Ed, out in Los Angeles, and a former Principal Learning Institute partner. Great work that he's doing around instructional technology in the LA community. I would encourage you to visit their website at chief.lausd.net. Folks like Ed and the ITI colleagues have really unpacked what it means to be a district that moves forward with the ISTE standards. So what does it mean to be a global collaborator? Lots of great ideas and resources around digital citizenship, which is really important in this environment as students get more and more engaged in these technology platforms and ways of sharing their story. I also see a great shout out to Kansas Department of Education with their continuity of learning plan. Great that you guys are putting these in here so that you can share with one another as well. So gonna just make sure we go back, and if there's any more questions. Gisela, I think you're in Albuquerque. To all panelists, this importance of demystifying distant learning and building more synergy between higher ed and K-12 faculty development, so very important. And part of the reason I'm intentionally using the words modern learning systems is much like that morning of what's happening with our bricks and mortars environment, is to say that maybe, and Dr. Ray's going to talk about this as well in her sessions, maybe it's not about distant or remote or online, which all of those things almost feel like non-relational, right? Like there's not a relationship there with the students just by the language or the nomenclature that we use. But maybe it's about saying that there's a new skill set and a new mindset in this modern learning environment that we need to be prepared for. So how might we transition that with some of these future orientations with how we personalize, design, lead, and organize those efforts inside this new type of box? So as we come to closure today, I want to also let you know, you're more than welcome to reach out to me at any time. I want to continue to be a champion for what I call Team Kid and always putting students at the center of everything that we do. You can reach me, as you saw on the email, at francisgipson2@cgu.edu. And I'm always happy to reach out to folks and connect with them. And I'd love to hear the stories about how you're changing your system, how you're helping others learn and lead together, and most importantly, how you're celebrating yourself and your students in these environments. So with that, I thank you, and congratulations to each and every one of you for the championing that you do each and every day in your environments. I celebrate you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Francis. We just want to say on behalf of the entire Tech and Learning team, thank you for attending today's session. And we would like to thank our sponsors and our association partners again for making this possible. Please join me in thanking all of our terrific speakers for today. And I also want to thank each and every one of you for joining us and spending this time together. Don't forget to join us again for our other sessions that are running all day today until 6 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to register for next week's Tech and Learning Roundtable webinar on Wednesday, June 3rd. We'll be joining Keisha Ray as she speaks about district leaders and the security issues related to online learning, such as school plans for next year, keeping data private, cybersecurity concerns, and monitoring online activity to make sure students are safe and content is appropriate. To register, please visit www.techlearning.com/events. We look forward to getting together with you all again in person, hopefully soon. But until then, stay safe and healthy.